The rain hammered against the windows that November evening, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the exhaustion Rachel felt in her bones. She stood in her grandmother's cramped attic, surrounded by decades of accumulated memories packed into cardboard boxes and covered in dust. At 32 years old, she'd spent the last 5 years juggling 2 part-time jobs while taking care of Grandma Rose. And tonight was just another evening of sorting through things that needed organizing. Rachel taught music at Lincoln High School 3 days a week, barely making enough to cover rent and groceries. The other 2 days, she gave piano lessons to kids in their homes, driving her beat-up Honda across town for $20 an hour. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she graduated with her music degree, drowning in student loans and hope. But life had a way of redirecting plans, especially when the people you loved needed you most. "Rachel, dear, are you finding anything up there?" Her grandmother's voice drifted up from the bottom of the attic stairs, weak but persistent. "Nothing important yet," Rachel called back, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the November chill. The attic had no heating. Her breath came out in small clouds. She pushed aside a stack of moth-eaten blankets and stopped short. There, wedged between an old wardrobe and boxes of Christmas decorations, stood an upright piano. Rachel blinked, certain she must have seen it before, but somehow the memory escaped her. The piano looked ancient, its dark wood scratched and faded, water stains creating irregular patterns across its surface. One of the legs had a visible crack. Several keys were missing their ivory covers. Rachel ran her hand along the dusty top, leaving clean streaks in her wake. She couldn't imagine how anyone had gotten this massive instrument up the narrow attic stairs. Her fingers found the keys, pressing down gently. A few notes rang out, surprisingly clear despite the piano's obvious age and neglect. Others produced nothing but dull thuds, or didn't respond at all. The sound must have carried downstairs because she heard movement below, slow, shuffling footsteps that made Rachel's heart clench with worry. Grandma Rose was 78, and her health had been declining steadily over the past year. The doctors used words like fragile and declining heart function, which were just polite ways of preparing Rachel for what was coming. "Don't come up here, Grandma." "The stairs are too steep," Rachel shouted, already moving toward the attic opening. But when she reached the top of the stairs, she found her grandmother already halfway up, gripping the railing with white knuckles. "I heard the piano," Rose said, her eyes brighter than Rachel had seen them in months. "You found it, Grandma. Please, let me help you back down. You shouldn't be climbing stairs." But Rose shook her head with surprising firmness. "I need to hear it. Just help me up, please." Rachel had learned not to argue when her grandmother used that tone. She carefully supported Rose up the remaining steps and guided her to an old chair near the piano. The elderly woman sat down heavily, her breathing labored, but her gaze fixed on the instrument with an intensity that bordered on desperation. "Play something," Rose said. "Grandma, half the keys don't work, and I don't even know if it's in tune. Play anything. Please, sweetheart." Rachel sat on the worn bench, testing keys until she found a section that produced relatively clear notes. She played a simple melody, something she often taught her students. The piano's tone was muffled and uneven, but it still carried a certain charm. It's like hearing a voice from the distant past. "Oh, no," Rose interrupted, waving her hand. "Let me show you." She stood with effort and came to stand beside Rachel, humming a melody so softly it was almost lost beneath the sound of rain on the roof. It was a simple tune, just a few measures that Rose repeated over and over. Haunting and melancholic, with a strange beauty that made Rachel's throat tighten. She'd never heard it before, and she'd grown up listening to her grandmother sing while cooking or gardening. This was something else entirely. "Where's that from?" Rachel asked, already picking out the notes on the piano by ear. Rose didn't answer immediately. She returned to her chair, her expression distant. "From a long time ago. Before I came to America. Before I met your grandfather?" Rachel stopped playing and turned to face her grandmother fully. In all her years, she'd heard very little about Rose's life before immigrating to Portland. The subject seemed to cause the old woman pain, so the family had learned not to push. "There was a time when I lived very differently," Rose continued, her voice barely above a whisper. In Buenos Aires, my family had money then. Not rich, you understand, but comfortable. We had a large house, servants, everything we needed. My father worked in banking. My mother hosted parties for important people. Rachel waited, hardly daring to breathe. This was more than her grandmother had shared in decades. We knew artists, composers, writers. They would come to our home. That melody, someone wrote it for me. A long time ago. Rose's eyes filled with tears. I was young and foolish. I fell in love with a man my parents didn't approve of. Your grandfather. He was American, working in Argentina, had nothing but dreams and a kind heart. When my parents refused to let us marry, we ran away together. You never told me that story, Rachel said softly. I wanted to forget it. But some things, they stay with you no matter how far you run or how many years pass. Rose looked at the piano with something like reverence. This piano, I insisted on bringing it with me when we left. Your grandfather thought I was crazy. We had so little money, and I wanted to spend it shipping this heavy thing across the ocean. But I couldn't leave it behind. The rain continued its steady drumbeat overhead. Rachel felt like she'd stumbled into a hidden chapter of her family's history, one that had been locked away in this attic along with the forgotten piano. Can you play that melody again? Rose asked. I haven't heard it in so long. Rachel turned back to the piano, finding the notes her grandmother had hummed. Her fingers moved slowly, carefully, bringing the simple tune to life. It was beautiful in an understated way, the kind of music that snuck up on you and lodged itself in your memory as she played. Rose closed her eyes, and tears rolled down her weathered cheeks. Rachel felt her own eyes burning. Something about this moment felt significant, though she couldn't explain why. The melody seemed to carry weight beyond its few simple notes, like it was holding secrets waiting to be discovered when Rachel finished. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken words. Her grandmother seemed lost in memories, her lips moving soundlessly as if carrying on conversations with ghosts from her past. Grandma, who wrote this song? Rose opened her eyes but didn't answer directly. Some choices we make when we're young, we think we're giving up everything. But sometimes what we carry with us is worth more than what we leave behind. She smiled sadly. I've been thinking about that piano for months now. Maybe it's time someone paid attention to it again. Rachel helped her grandmother back downstairs, settling her into bed with extra blankets and hot tea. But long after Rose fell asleep, Rachel remained awake. She couldn't stop humming that melody. Couldn't shake the feeling that the old piano in the attic was more than just a piece of furniture. Her grandmother had stubbornly brought from Argentina the next morning. Rachel found herself pulling up the attic stairs before work, drawn back to the piano. In the gray light of dawn, it looked even more worn and forgotten. But as she ran her fingers across its scarred surface, she felt connected to something larger than herself. To a young woman who'd risked everything for love, to a melody that had survived decades of silence. She took out her phone and recorded herself humming the tune, playing it back as she drove to school. All day between classes and during her lunch break, she found herself listening to it. Letting the simple melody work its way deeper into her consciousness, Rachel had no idea that this forgotten piano and its mysterious song would soon change everything about her life. That hidden within its battered frame lay answers to questions she didn't even know to ask. That her grandmother's past was about to reach across the decades and reshape her future in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. For now, she just had the melody, the mystery, and a growing sense that something important was waiting to be discovered. 3 months passed like water through Rachel's fingers. Winter arrived cold and unforgiving, and with it came the phone call she'd been dreading. She was at school, between classes, when her phone buzzed. It was Mrs. Chen from next door. Her voice shaking as she explained that she'd found Grandma Rose, unresponsive in her armchair. The doctors said it was peaceful. Heart failure, they called it. As if giving it a medical name made losing the last person who truly knew her any easier to bear. Rachel went through the funeral arrangements in a fog, nodding at decisions she barely understood, signing papers that blurred before her eyes. The bills started arriving within days. Hospital charges from the emergency room, visit, ambulance fees. The funeral home costs that shocked her despite knowing funerals were expensive. Rachel stared at the numbers on her laptop screen one night, her stomach churning. $23,000. She had maybe $2,000 in her checking account and a credit card that was already half maxed out. She picked up extra piano lessons, said yes to every student who called. She started selling things. Her grandmother's furniture went first, then her own. The TV, the nice coffee maker her ex-boyfriend had given her, even some of her own jewelry. But it barely made a dent. The debt collectors started calling by week 3, their voices polite but insistent. Rachel found herself back in that attic on a gray February afternoon, looking for anything else she could sell. She'd already taken the vintage lamps in the old trunk that turned out to be worth $50 at the antique shop. Now she stood in front of that piano again, the one her grandmother had loved so much. She ran her hand along its surface, remembering Rose's tears as Rachel had played that mysterious melody. The piano was worthless, probably. Too damaged to interest any serious buyer, too heavy to move without spending money she didn't have, but maybe someone would buy it for parts. Or maybe a music school would take it as a donation for a tax write-off she desperately needed. Rachel sat down on the bench, playing that haunting tune one more time. Her fingers had memorized it completely now. Sometimes she caught herself humming it while grading papers or driving to lessons. It had become part of her, a connection to her grandmother that death couldn't sever as she played. Her foot bumped against something under the piano. She looked down, frowning. There was a seam along the bottom panel, a line that looked too deliberate to be accidental. Rachel got down on her knees, running her fingers along the edge. It felt loose, like it had been designed to open. Her heart started beating faster. She ran downstairs and grabbed a screwdriver from the kitchen drawer, then hurried back up. The screws were old and stiff, but they turned eventually. The panel came away with a creak that seemed too loud in the quiet attic. Behind it was a hollow space. Tucked inside that space was an envelope, yellow with age, sealed with wax that had cracked over the decades. Rachel's hands trembled as she pulled it out, careful not to tear the fragile paper. She sat on the dusty floor and opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, handwritten in Spanish. The ink faded but still legible. Rachel's Spanish was rusty, learned from her grandmother and half forgotten over the years, but she could make out enough. The date at the top read 1952. It was addressed to Rose. Written by someone named Eduardo, her father. Rachel's eyes moved down the page, translating in her head. Eduardo wrote about heartbreak and anger, but also love and resignation. He wrote about his daughter's choice to leave everything behind for a man he didn't trust. But then the letter shifted, and Rachel's breath caught in her throat. I cannot stop you from leaving, but I will not let you go with nothing. The composition that Alberto wrote for you, I have placed it here in this piano you insist on taking. He signed it himself. He told me it might be worth something one day, though I pray you never need to sell it. Keep it safe. Let it remind you of who you were and who you might have been. Rachel's hands shook so badly she almost dropped the letter. Tucked behind it was another document. Sheets of thick paper covered in handwritten musical notation. At the top, in flowing script, it read Para Rosa, followed by a signature. Below that, in smaller writing, was a title Canción de Lena. But it was the signature that made Rachel's heart pound. She pulled out her phone, typing with fumbling fingers, Alberto Ginestra, composer Argentina. The search results loaded, and Rachel felt the attic tilt around her. Alberto Ginestra, one of the most important composers of 20th century classical music. The article called him Argentina's greatest musical voice, compared him to Stravinsky and Bartók. Born in Buenos Aires in 1916, died in Geneva in 1983. Rachel scrolled frantically, looking for anything about original manuscripts, about values, about authentication. The information was scattered and technical. But one thing became clear. Original Ginastera manuscripts were incredibly rare. Most were held in museums or private collections. At auction, they sold for tremendous amounts of money. She looked down at the sheets in her lap. At the careful notation and the signature at the top, Her grandmother had carried this across an ocean, hidden in a piano. She'd lived in poverty for years, struggled to make ends meet, and never once mentioned that she had something potentially valuable locked away in her attic. Rachel's mind raced. If this was real, if it was actually authentic, it could solve all her problems. The debt would disappear. She could stop working herself to exhaustion. Maybe even keep her grandmother's house instead of selling it like she'd been planning. But the word "if" loomed large. How did you authenticate something like this? Where did you even start? Rachel spent the rest of that afternoon on her phone, searching and reading until her eyes burned. Authentication was complex, expensive, and required experts she'd never heard of. The costs started at several $1,000s. Money she absolutely didn't have. She called the music department at Portland State University the next morning, her voice shaking as she tried to explain what she'd found. The secretary was polite but dismissive. They didn't authenticate manuscripts. She should try auction houses in New York or Los Angeles. The auction houses were more interested. Their questions intimidated her. Provenance, they called it. The history of ownership. Could she prove the manuscript had been in her family since 1952? Did she have documentation? Photographs. Anything besides the letter from a grandfather she'd never met? Rachel felt hope slipping away with each phone call. Everyone wanted proof she didn't have. Everyone wanted money she couldn't pay. Several people suggested, kindly but firmly, that she probably had a reproduction or a student copy. Nothing valuable. One Thursday evening, desperate and exhausted, Rachel did something she'd never done before. She took clear photos of the manuscript in her grandmother's story, and posted them on a classical music forum she'd found. Her post was simple, honest, probably too hopeful. Found this hidden in my grandmother's piano. She came from Argentina in 1952. Could this be real? She hit submit and closed her laptop, feeling foolish. What were the chances anyone would even see it? What were the chances it mattered? The response came faster than she ever imagined. By the next morning, her post had 37 replies. By afternoon, over 100. People debated and discussed, some skeptical, others intrigued. Music scholars weighed in with technical observations about the notation style. Someone pointed out details that matched Ganostra's known work from that period. Then, on the third day, Rachel received a private message that changed everything. It was from Dr. Patricia Castellano, a professor at UCLA who specialized in Latin American classical music. She'd written extensively about Ginostera, published books and articles, served as a consultant for major orchestras. Her message was direct. I've been studying your post and the photos you shared. There are details in this manuscript that are extremely interesting. The harmonic progressions, the rhythmic patterns, even the way the notes are written on the staff. I'd like to examine the original document in person. Would you be willing to bring it to Los Angeles? I should tell you up front that I can't promise anything, but I think this deserves serious attention. Rachel read the message 3 times, her heart hammering. She looked at the manuscript lying on her kitchen table, protected now in a plastic sleeve she'd bought at the office supply store. This could be it. The answer she needed. Or it could be another dead end, another disappointment. But what choice did she have? The debt wasn't going away. Her grandmother's house was heading toward foreclosure. She was drowning, and this mysterious piece of paper might be the only lifeline she'd get. Rachel typed her response with shaking fingers. Yes, tell me when and where. I'll be there. Rachel's hands wouldn't stop shaking as she boarded the flight to Los Angeles. She'd put the plane ticket on her credit card, watching the available balance drop to almost nothing. The manuscript sat in her carry-on bag, wrapped in acid-free paper she'd bought at an art supply store, tucked inside a rigid portfolio case she'd borrowed from another teacher at school. She kept the bag on her lap the entire flight, unable to relax even for a moment. Dr. Castellano had offered to meet her at a cafe near the UCLA campus. Rachel spotted her immediately when she walked in. The professor was in her mid-50s. With gray-streaked dark hair pulled back in a loose bun and reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked up from her laptop and smiled warmly, standing to shake Rachel's hand. You must be exhausted, Dr. Castellano said, gesturing to a chair. Can I get you coffee? Something to eat? Rachel shook her head, too nervous to think about food. I just want to know if it's real. The professor's expression turned serious. I understand. But first, I need you to understand something. I've dedicated my career to studying Ginastera's work. I've examined every authenticated manuscript I could get access to. That means I'm going to be thorough, probably more skeptical than you'd like. If this isn't genuine, I'll tell you. And if it is, well, that would be extraordinary. Rachel nodded, carefully removing the portfolio from her bag. Her fingers fumbled with the zipper. Dr. Castellano put on a pair of white cotton gloves before taking the manuscript, handling it with a reverence that made Rachel's throat tighten. The professor was silent for a long time, her eyes moving across the pages with intense concentration. She pulled out a magnifying glass, examining the paper's edges, the ink strokes, even the way the staff lines had been drawn. Rachel sat frozen, barely breathing, watching every flicker of expression cross Dr. Castellano's face. Tell me everything you know about how your grandmother got this, the professor finally said. Not looking up from the manuscript, Rachel told the story again. About Grandma Rose, leaving Argentina in 1952, about falling in love with an American, about the piano that came with her across the ocean, about finding the letter from her grandfather, Eduardo, mentioning Alberto in a composition he'd written for Rose. Dr. Castellano listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a small pad. When Rachel finished, the professor sat back in her chair, removing her glasses and rubbing her eyes. The paper is right for the period, she said slowly. The ink appears to be iron gall, which is what would have been commonly used in the early 1950s. The notation style matches Ginastera's hand from his early works. But more than that, there are compositional fingerprints here that interest me deeply. What do you mean? Rachel leaned forward. Every composer has habits, patterns they fall into without realizing it. The way they voice chords, the rhythmic figures they favor, the harmonic progressions they return to. This piece, it has Ginastera written all over it. These syncopated rhythms here, this is very characteristic of his style from that period. And this harmonic movement, the way it shifts between major and minor, this is something he explored extensively in his early chamber works. Rachel felt hope rising in her chest like a balloon. So it's real? I'm saying it's possible. But possible isn't the same as proven. I need to do more testing. Carbon dating on the paper, chemical analysis of the ink, comparison with verified exemplars of his handwriting from the same period. All of this takes time and money. The balloon deflated. How much money? Dr. Castellano named a figure that made Rachel's stomach drop. $12,000, minimum. Maybe more, depending on what the initial tests showed. I don't have that, Rachel said quietly. I don't have anything close to that. The professor was quiet for a moment, studying Rachel's face. Tell me about your grandmother. What was she like? The question surprised Rachel, but she found herself answering. She talked about Rose's garden, how she grew tomatoes and herbs even when her hands got too arthritic to properly grip the tools. About her terrible singing voice that never stopped her from singing anyway. About how she'd worked as a seamstress for 40 years, her fingers flying over fabric, creating beauty from scraps. About how she'd never complained, never talked about the life she'd left behind, never asked for anything except Rachel's company on Sunday afternoons. When Rachel finished, her eyes were wet. Dr. Castellano's expression had softened considerably. My grandmother came from Mexico with nothing but the clothes on her back, the professor said. She cleaned houses so my mother could go to school. I think about her every day when I walk into my office at the university. She paused, looking down at the manuscript again. I'll cover the authentication costs myself, not as a loan, as an investment in finding the truth. If this turns out to be genuine, we'll figure out fair compensation then. If it's not, well, some stories are worth the effort of investigation, regardless of the outcome. Rachel couldn't speak. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, overwhelmed by this stranger's unexpected kindness. The testing took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of Rachel jumping every time her phone rang, checking her email obsessively, barely sleeping. She'd taken a second job waitressing on weekends, trying to keep ahead of the bills that kept coming. The foreclosure notice on her grandmother's house arrived in a certified letter that made her hands shake so badly she could barely sign for it. Dr. Castellano sent updates when she could. The paper had been sent to a lab that specialized in dating historical documents. The ink was being analyzed by a forensic chemist. Handwriting experts were comparing the manuscript against authenticated Ginastera signatures from the early 1950s. Each test took time, required careful procedures, demanded patience Rachel didn't have. Finally, on a Tuesday morning in April, Dr. Castellano called. Rachel was at school, sitting in her empty classroom during lunch break, eating a peanut butter sandwich she'd made at home to save money. "I have news," the professor said, and Rachel couldn't read anything in her tone. "Are you sitting down?" "Please just tell me," Rachel whispered. "It's authentic. Every test confirms it. The paper dates to the right period. The ink is consistent with materials used in Buenos Aires in the early 1950s. The handwriting is a perfect match for Ginastera's exemplars from 1952. And perhaps most importantly, I had 2 other Ginastera scholars examine high-resolution scans, and they both independently confirmed that the compositional style is unmistakably his." Rachel couldn't breathe. The classroom spun around her. "Rachel, are you there?" "I'm here," she managed. "It's really real?" "It's real. You have an unknown, unpublished Ginastera composition. As far as we can determine, this is the only copy in existence." "Rachel, do you understand what this means? This isn't just valuable. This is historically significant. This is a piece of musical history that the world thought was lost or never existed." After she hung up, Rachel sat alone in her classroom for a long time. She thought about her grandmother carrying this secret across an ocean, about Eduardo hiding it in the piano, hoping it would protect his daughter someday, about all the years Rose had struggled financially, never once mentioning that she had something valuable locked away in her attic. Why hadn't she sold it? Why had she lived so simply, worked so hard when this manuscript could have changed everything? Rachel didn't have answers, but she was starting to understand that maybe her grandmother's choices had been more deliberate than she'd realized. Maybe Rose had been protecting something more important than money. Maybe she'd been waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right purpose. That evening, Rachel received an email from Christie's auction house in New York. Dr. Castellano had sent them information about the authentication, and they were very interested in discussing a potential sale. Their preliminary estimate, based on recent sales of similar items and the rarity of Ginastera manuscripts, was between $350,000 and $500,000. Rachel read the numbers 3 times. She thought about her debts, about the foreclosure notice, about the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. She thought about never worrying about money again, about security and stability and breathing room. But she also thought about her, to grandmother's face when she'd heard that melody after so many years, about the tears that had rolled down Rose's weathered cheeks, about a young woman giving up everything for love, and the music that had followed her across the world. The decision she needed to make was bigger than she'd imagined. And somewhere deep inside, Rachel was beginning to realize that the easy choice and the right choice might not be the same thing at all. The woman from Christie's had a smooth, professional voice that somehow made Rachel feel both important and completely out of her depth. Her name was Victoria, and she'd handled sales of rare musical manuscripts for over 20 years. She spoke about provenance and market conditions and collector interest with the ease of someone discussing the weather. "We're looking at a spring auction," Victoria explained during their 3rd phone call. "That gives us time to properly market the piece, reach out to our most serious collectors. Based on current market conditions and the rarity of authenticated Ginastera works, I'm confident we're looking at the higher end of our estimate, possibly beyond it if we get the right bidders in the room." Rachel did the math in her head. $500,000? Maybe more. She could pay off every debt, save her grandmother's house, quit the waitressing job, maybe even take a real vacation for the first time in years. She could breathe again. "There's significant interest already," Victoria continued. "I've had preliminary inquiries from 3 private collectors and 1 major institution. Everyone wants to be ready when this goes to auction. After the call ended, Rachel sat at her grandmother's old kitchen table, surrounded by bills. The foreclosure notice sat on top, stamped with red letters that seemed to grow larger every time she looked at it. Next to it was a letter from the hospital's collection agency, another from the funeral home. A credit card statement with an interest rate that made her want to cry. She pulled out her calculator and started adding. Medical bills, funeral costs, the mortgage payments she'd missed, her own student loans that she'd been deferring for months. The total came to just over $43,000. Even after taxes and Christie's commission, the manuscript would solve everything with plenty left over. The logical choice was obvious. Sell it. Move on. Start fresh. So why did her stomach hurt every time she thought about it? Rachel opened her laptop and searched for Ginastera's music on YouTube. She'd been doing this a lot lately, listening to his piano sonatas, his string quartets, his ballet scores. The music was complex and beautiful, full of Argentine rhythms and modernist harmonies that challenged and rewarded careful listening. She thought about her students at Lincoln High. Most of them came from families like hers. Families where money was always tight and opportunities were limited. She taught them Mozart and Bach and Chopin, but she rarely had the chance to introduce them to composers like Ginastera. The classical music world felt distant from their lives, exclusive and expensive, something for other people. What if it didn't have to be that way? The thought arrived quietly, but once it was there, Rachel couldn't shake it. She thought about her grandmother, about why Rose might have kept the manuscript hidden all those years. Maybe it wasn't because she didn't know its value. Maybe it was because she did. Rachel called Dr. Castellano the next morning. "Can I ask you something? If I sold this to a private collector, what would happen to it?" The professor was quiet for a moment. Most likely, it would go into a collection. The owner might loan it to museums occasionally, but mainly, it would be preserved as an investment. The music itself might never be performed. A shame, really. This piece deserves to be heard. What if I didn't sell it? What other options are there? Well, you could donate it to an institution, a university, a museum, a library. You'd get a tax deduction, though nothing close to what you'd get from selling it outright. Or you could retain ownership, but license performance rights publish the score. That would generate some income over time, but again, nothing like an auction sale. Rachel thanked her and hung up, her mind racing. She spent the next week researching music publishing, performance rights, educational licensing. She talked to lawyers about trusts and foundations. She called music schools and community orchestras, asking questions that probably seemed strange to them. Her best friend Lisa thought she was losing her mind. They met for coffee, and Rachel tried to explain her thinking. "You're broke," Lisa said bluntly. "The bank is literally trying to take your grandmother's house. And you're considering turning down $500,000? Rachel, I love you, but this is crazy." "I know how it sounds," Rachel said. "But what if there's a way to honor what my grandmother actually wanted? She lived poor her entire life in America. She could have sold this any time. She chose not to. Maybe she didn't know what it was worth. Maybe she did, and money wasn't the point." Rachel stirred her coffee, trying to find the right words. "I keep thinking about my students. About kids who will never hear this music because it'll be locked in some collector's vault. About musicians who should have the chance to perform an unknown Ginastera piece, but won't because someone's treating it like a stock certificate." Lisa sighed. "I get what you're saying. I do. But you can't save the world if you're drowning yourself." She was right, of course. Rachel knew she was right. But something deeper was pulling at her, something she couldn't quite articulate. It had to do with legacy and meaning, with the difference between existing and mattering. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She got up at 2 in the morning and drove to her grandmother's house, letting herself in with the key she still carried. The house was dark and empty, already feeling abandoned. She climbed the attic stairs one more time and sat at the old piano. Her fingers found those familiar notes, the melody that had started everything. She played it slowly, thinking about Rose hearing it for the first time in Buenos Aires. About the composer who'd written it for a young woman he probably barely knew. About the journey it had taken across oceans and decades. Rachel thought about her own journey. About the music degree she'd earned despite everyone saying it was impractical. about choosing teaching when she could have pursued performance, about moving home to take care of her grandmother when her friends were building careers in other cities. Every choice had been the harder path, the one that made less financial sense. But those choices had made her who she was. And sitting there in that attic, playing that melody in the dark, Rachel realized she already knew what she was going to do. The knowledge had been there all along. Waiting for her to catch up to it, she called Victoria at Christie's the next morning before she could change her mind. "I need to withdraw the manuscript from auction," Rachel said, her voice steadier than she felt. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Rachel wondered if the call had dropped. Victoria finally said, and Rachel could hear the confusion in her voice. "I'm not sure you understand what you're walking away from. We have confirmed interest at the 500,000 level. One collector has indicated he might go as high as 600. This is generational wealth we're discussing." "I understand," Rachel said. "But I'm making a different choice." She called Dr. Castellano next. "I want to publish the music. I want it performed. I want students and community orchestras to have access to it without paying thousands of dollars for licensing. And I want to set up something, some kind of fund or program that uses whatever income it generates to help music students who can't afford instruments or lessons." Dr. Castellano was quiet for a long moment. Then Rachel heard something that might have been a soft laugh. "You know, this is financial insanity, right? Everyone keeps telling me that. Good, because it is. It's also one of the most meaningful things I've heard anyone do with a discovery like this." The professor's voice grew warmer. "Let's figure out how to make it work." The next few weeks were a blur of meetings with lawyers, music publishers, and nonprofit advisors. Rachel learned more about copyright law and licensing agreements than she'd ever wanted to know. Every professional she talked to gave her the same speech about leaving money on the table, about being practical, about taking care of herself first. But Rachel had made her choice. And somewhere deep inside, she felt more certain about it than anything she'd done in years. The manuscript wouldn't make her rich. But maybe, just maybe, it would make her grandmother proud. And maybe that was worth more than all the money in the world. Rachel signed the papers on a Thursday afternoon in May, her hand cramping from writing her name so many times. The partnership with the University of Southern California's music press would publish Canción de Elena under a special license that kept the price affordable for schools and community groups. She'd retain ownership of the manuscript itself, but the music would belong to the world. The lawyer handling the nonprofit paperwork looked at her over his reading glasses. "You understand that the income from this will be modest, right? Maybe 20 to 30,000 a year if we're lucky. After expenses for the foundation, you're looking at a small salary at best." Rachel nodded. She'd already done the math 100 times. It wasn't enough to get rich, but it was enough to pay off her debts slowly, to keep her grandmother's house, to survive while still teaching. It was enough. What she hadn't expected was how fast the news would spread. Dr. Castellano's university published a press release about the discovery. A local newspaper picked it up. Then the Los Angeles Times ran a feature story. Within a week, NPR called wanting an interview. The story had everything reporters loved. A hidden treasure, a grandmother's secret, a young woman choosing meaning over money. Rachel found herself sitting in a radio studio, nervous and overwhelmed, trying to explain her decision to a host who kept calling her inspiring. "But you were in debt," the host pressed. "You could have solved all your financial problems. Why didn't you just sell it?" Rachel thought about her grandmother's face, about those tears as she'd listened to that melody after so many years. "Because some things matter more than money," she said simply. "My grandmother kept this hidden for 70 years. She could have sold it any time. She chose not to. I think she was waiting for someone who would understand that the music itself was the treasure, not what you could get for it." The interview went viral. Rachel's inbox flooded with messages from strangers. Some called her foolish. Others called her a hero. Most just wanted to hear the story, to understand what would make someone walk away from that much money, the foundation she'd created. The Rose Torres Music Fund started receiving donations. Small amounts mostly, $20 here, $50 there. But they added up. A retired music teacher in Ohio sent $100 with a note saying she wished someone had helped her buy a clarinet when she was 12. A grandmother in Florida sent $50 in memory of her own grandmother, who'd love to sing. 3 months after the announcement, Rachel received an email that made her cry at her kitchen table. The Buenos Aires Symphony Orchestra wanted to premiere Canción de Elena at their season-opening concert. They'd send a recording to Rachel, and they wanted her to be there in person if possible. She couldn't afford the trip. But when she mentioned it during a local TV interview, a travel company offered to donate the flight and hotel. Suddenly, she was on a plane to Argentina. Traveling to the country her grandmother had left behind so many years ago, Buenos Aires was beautiful and overwhelming. The symphony orchestra treated Rachel like visiting royalty, showing her the concert hall, introducing her to the musicians. The conductor, a serious man named Antonio with silver hair and kind eyes, spent an hour talking with her about the piece. "The music is remarkable," he said in accented English. "Very Ginastera, but also something unique. You can hear the influence of Argentine folk rhythms, but there's a tenderness here that's quite moving. He must have cared deeply for your grandmother to write something this personal." The night of the premiere, Rachel sat in the audience wearing a dress she'd borrowed from Lisa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The concert hall was packed. As the orchestra began to play, Rachel closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. It was beautiful. The simple melody she'd first heard her grandmother hum had been transformed into something rich and complex. The full orchestra bringing out layers she'd never imagined. The strings sang with longing. The woodwinds added touches of joy and sadness. The piano wove through it all with that haunting theme. When it ended, the audience sat in stunned silence for a moment before erupting into applause. Rachel wiped tears from her cheeks as people around her stood, clapping and calling out. Antonio turned and gestured for her to stand, and suddenly everyone was looking at her, applauding not just the music but the story behind it. After the concert, an elderly woman approached Rachel in the lobby. She had white hair and moved slowly with a cane, but her eyes were sharp and bright. "Your grandmother was Rosa Elena Mendoza, yes?" the woman asked in Spanish. Rachel nodded, surprised to hear her grandmother's full maiden name. "I knew her," the woman said softly. "Not well, but we attended some of the same gatherings when we were young. She was very beautiful, very kind. When she left with that American, everyone talked about it for months. Some said she was foolish, but I always thought she was brave." The woman smiled. "I think she would be very proud of what you've done." Rachel could barely speak through her tears. To meet someone who'd known her grandmother as a young woman, who remembered her before the years of struggle and sacrifice, felt like receiving an unexpected gift. Back in Portland, life slowly found a new rhythm. The foundation started its work, providing instruments and lesson scholarships to students who couldn't afford them. The first recipient was a girl named Maya from Rachel's own school. A quiet 8th grader with an incredible voice, but no money for vocal coaching. Rachel watched Maya's face light up when they told her she'd been selected, and something inside her chest expanded. This was why she'd made her choice. Not for the recognition or the news stories, but for this moment. For this girl who would get a chance she wouldn't have had otherwise. The manuscript itself lived at USC now, in a climate-controlled vault where it would be preserved for future generations. But Rachel had kept something, the old piano from her grandmother's attic. She'd had it restored, a process that cost more than she probably should have spent. But when it was finished, when she sat down and played that melody on the same keys her grandmother had played 70 years ago, the expense didn't matter. 5 years passed. Canción de Elena became a beloved piece in the classical repertoire, performed by orchestras and chamber groups around the world. Every performance generated a small royalty that fed the foundation. The Rose Torres Music Fund had helped over 300 students by then, providing instruments, lessons, and opportunities that might have remained forever out of reach. Rachel still taught at Lincoln High. She still lived modestly, still worried about money sometimes. But the crushing debt was gone. Her grandmother's house was hers, filled now with memories both old and new. She'd started a relationship with another teacher at school, A gentle man who understood her choices and didn't think she was crazy on a Saturday morning in October. Rachel stood in the auditorium of Lincoln High School, watching the youth orchestra prepare for their fall concert. These were her students, kids from working-class families, immigrants and first-generation Americans. Dreamers who loved music, despite every practical reason to pursue something more financially sensible. The orchestra was performing Canción de Elena as their opening piece. Maya, now a senior, stood ready to sing a vocal arrangement that Rachel had commissioned. The melody that had started with a grandmother's humming in an attic, it had grown into something that connected generations and crossed borders. As the first notes rang out, Rachel thought about inheritance. Not the kind measured in bank accounts or real estate, but the kind that lives in choices and sacrifices and love that spans decades. Her grandmother had given her something more valuable than money. She'd given her a chance to matter, to make a difference, to transform personal loss into collective gain. The music swelled, filling the auditorium with that haunting melody. Rachel closed her eyes and could almost feel her grandmother beside her, could almost hear Rose's soft humming joining with the orchestra. And in that moment, Rachel knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice. Some people measure wealth in dollars. Others measure it in impact, in lives touched, in beauty shared. Rachel had chosen the latter, and in doing so, had become richer than any bank account could ever make her. The inheritance that changed her future wasn't the manuscript at all. It was understanding what truly mattered and having the courage to choose it even when the whole world told her she was wrong. That lesson, passed from grandmother to granddaughter across time and struggle and an ocean of years, was worth more than all the treasures in the world. And as the final notes of Canción de Elena faded into silence, followed by thunderous applause from proud parents and moved teachers, Rachel smiled through her tears and knew her grandmother was smiling too.